To start out, tell us a bit more about the Wales Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and the creation of your role and how you fit within the Wales government ecosystem.
So I'm Wales's second Future Generations Commissioner, so only 4 months in post. And my job is independent of government whilst being appointed of Welsh Government. And the job is to look out for the interests of future generations. What that means in practice is we have a law in Wales since 2015 called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And that law applies to public bodies, so local authorities, councils, health boards, devolved public institutions. And they're obliged to think about well-being and the long term in all that they do. And there are guidance documents and all sorts of information that support them to do that. But we're working towards 7 well-being goals, which are really interesting them in themselves. And they put at the heart of government and how we do things in Wales, sustainable development and the sustainable development principle. And so they're obliged to follow this legislation, as I say, in all that they do. And my job is to assess and monitor their progress, to advise and support them to make progress that we want to see, and potentially to call things out where I'm not seeing the progress that I would like to see. I can also undertake deep dives. So we call them Section 20 reviews. So where we think there's a particular issue that needs looking into in more depth, perhaps where we're making not enough progress, I can ask for a Section 20 review, and they're obliged, public bodies and others are obliged to take part in that and to respond to the recommendations I make. So there are significant powers attached to the role, but there are also a lot of soft powers attached to the role as well. So the ability to convene, the ability to put a spotlight onto particular issues is something that the role enjoys. And I've been joking in my previous job in the third sector, in the charity sector, if I'd written to the 22 local authorities that exist in Wales and asked to meet with the chief executive, maybe 3 of them would have written back and 1 would have agreed to meet. But in this role, they all write back and they all agree to meet, which is a fantastic opportunity and means, a great opportunity to have conversations and to support and influence what they do.
Yeah, well, so there's 2 terms that I would be interested in hearing you flesh out. Just what do you mean by long term, and what do you mean by thinking of the interests of future generations? Just how far out and
Yeah, well, I guess it depends, and that's not prescribed. I think in our office, we tend to think in terms of 2 or 3 generations, 50, 75, 100 years. But that's very difficult in practice for public bodies in Wales to do. And so we encourage them as far as possible to think as long term as they can. And, for example, we might see, and we have seen healthcare strategies now that go on for 10 years, which is an improvement on where they used to be. So not quite the long-term aspiration yet, perhaps, that we would like to see, but nonetheless longer term than has previously been the case. And I guess that follows, that's what we mean really in terms of future generations. So we're not talking about necessarily young people today. Obviously, they are our future, but we're thinking of those people not yet born and the generations to come. So it's about acting today um, for resolving today's problems whilst also resolving tomorrow's problems as well. So not putting a sticking plaster on things, not creating problems that we're going to just have to sort out in years to come, but doing both at the same time, recognizing that there are, very real issues for public bodies to face today, but they need to be thinking about doing that in a long-term way that doesn't store up problems for the future.
And why do you think Wales was such fertile ground for the creation of this act and a position like yours? What about Wales is unique that put it at the forefront of this kind of future generations movement?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Ever since we've had devolution in Wales, so that's since 1999, where Wales, as part of the UK, was given devolved powers over things like health and education. Sustainable development has been very much part of the thinking. And that was strengthened with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So I think it's very much part of what we think about in terms of devolution, and it's been led by politicians such as Jane Davidson, who pioneered the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, who were really committed to this and wanted to make it work. I think also there's a good fit. So a lot of what Wales is about beautiful countryside and mountains, very dependent on our natural resources, a country that has heavily relied on fossil fuels, coal industry, for example, for our prosperity, and a country that's needed to change and make a difference. Couldn't continue in that way, and was looking to understand how it could be as a country, how we could be as a country in the future, and what that would look like. So I think it has also felt like something that has been part of our narrative and the narrative that we wanted to create for ourselves as a country.
Well, I would like to hear more about how the act was passed. Was there an organization pushing for it? You mentioned was her I forget her name already.
Jane Davidson.
Jane Davidson. Like, how did this happen?
Well, there were lots of things that happened, and I wasn't directly involved at the time. I was involved in on the sidelines, I guess, in the third sector. But Jane Davidson was a leading politician in the early years of the legislation, proposing it and convincing other politicians in the country of the need for it. So she was inspirational in making it happen. But I think, frankly, it probably wouldn't have happened without a lot of support and commitment from the charity sector and the third sector, from those outside that campaigned for this. So WWF, the Worldwide Foundation Fund for Nature, has been key in making this happen, putting their own hand in their pocket to invest in research and so forth to understand it might happen, and to be influencing politicians to make it happen. I think one of the things that I was more directly involved in, but was not leading, was a national conversation, which we called the Wales We Want. So there was a big involvement and engagement exercise with the people of Wales to understand what we wanted as a country and where we wanted to go as a country. And so that was extremely influential, I think, in helping us to get to where we wanted to go, and putting in place the well-being goals, which set the direction that we want as a country. So those set the direction. We talk in terms of 2050, and that conversation was extremely useful, and I think underpins how we work today. So I didn't talk in depth about it, but the legislation requires public bodies to think about the 5 ways of working, which is how we incorporate the sustainable development principle into practical action. And one of those ways of working is involvement. And we don't mean passive consultation. We mean real involvement with those people affected by the decisions, taking a role in influencing those decisions. So the Wales We Want was a very involving conversation. And when we see real action by public bodies, I often also see a great deal of proper, meaningful engagement and involvement of the people concerned, which brings about the kind of urgent and bold action that we want to see.
That's so interesting to me, because we often talk about how we would like to bring the love and caring that's between generations and families into the world of politics, because the world of politics does operate on shorter term time frames because of elections and just the interests of elected leaders. So that involvement process, do you think that was really key in?
I think it was critical. Yeah, I think the involvement side of things has been critical in creating an important number of people that were right behind this legislation and supporting and urging the politicians to bring it about. You know, there was an eye on it so that people wouldn't let it go. It wasn't something that could have been easily dropped because there wasn't enough parliamentary time or because they couldn't get it right. People really felt that they wanted this legislation. And what you see now is a country that's very proud of it. And many people very proud that a small country like Wales, only 3 million people, you know, dominated by a much bigger neighbour in a, you know, in a much bigger country, we have a piece of legislation that people are interested, like yourselves in Canada, all around the world. And although we've got a long way to go with it, we're very proud that we're trying something world leading and pioneering that can make can make a real difference. So that involvement aspect to it is really key. I think it's key going forward. So my job is about making impact. You know, it's not, I'm not here just to, you know, keep the chair warm. I'm here to support public bodies to make an impact. And, you know, most of the public body leaders that I meet are really keen to do the same, but they're they're in really challenging circumstances often. So it's about how you support them to do that. And I think involving people and the population in that process is going to be critical to making the change that we want to. Sorry, I have some cake delivered. um, I forgot to tell my wow, I mean, this gives an impression that, you know, I just have cake and coffee delivered. My partner has just delivered some freshly made cake, which is very nice. Um, Yes, yeah, he's done a great job. What was I saying? So I can start that again, actually. So one of the things I think is critical is people's engagement in involvement in the legislation. It feels to me, in some ways, like a People's Act. It's law for the people, and although it applies to public bodies, we're probably really dependent, or we are dependent on people um, urging and encouraging and calling out public bodies who are not acting on the legislation. You know, I'm just one person with a small team, but if we can enable and empower the people of Wales to to challenge decisions or to influence decisions where they feel that the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act should be applied or isn't being applied, then we're going to go much further and make more of an impact. And we are starting to see that. We do see that, for example, in planning decisions, whereby, you know, people will call things out and say, well, actually, is this really in line with the well-being of future generations? Is this about the long term? Are we considering our children and our children's children, and asking public bodies to justify their decisions on that basis?
It's a good segue to another thing that we're interested in because I think we mentioned we're one of our goals is to have Canada create a Minister of Generational Fairness. So we'd really like to learn from what your position, where it succeeded and where you wish you had, where you wish it was different. And so it sounds like you have some teeth as a watchdog of this act, but how does that work? Like, can you just stop something from happening? And why do you think you were chosen to be a commissioner? Like, what power does that give you?
Yeah, there are pros and cons of the minister versus the commissioner role. I think one of the advantages of being a commissioner is that you're independent and you're not re-elected, you're appointed. So I'm in post for 7 years, so I'm not having an eye on the future, an eye on getting. I do have an eye on the future. That's not what I mean, but that's the whole point of the job. Yeah, yeah. I'm not having an eye on being re-elected because I can't be re-elected. It's an appointed post, and you can only do it for 7 years. Yeah, if you see what I mean. So very much with an eye on the future, but uh, well, that means I can say things perhaps that politicians might find uncomfortable to say because uh, they might not want to be unpopular, and they don't want to, do something that might damage their electoral success. Well, I don't need to worry about that, so I can create a space and speak truth to power, I think, on those real issues that are really important for the long term. On the other hand, that means, I'm not resourced like a minister. I can't stop things happening. I don't have huge budgets. I'm not responsible for the delivery of certain programs or services or agendas. So whilst I can support government and public bodies to deliver on their agendas. I can advise, and we do, to help implement things to best effect and to make a real impact. I don't have the resources of a minister and the powers of a minister. So, it's about influencing and persuading and making the case and so forth. So it's quite a different role. So there are real pros and cons. I'd be interested in how you get on with that because I think one of the things that I really think is important in this role is the independence, sorry, of the role, and the fact that you can call things out in a way that perhaps others couldn't.
If you could be an orthodontist and give yourself, a change to the teeth that you have, would you add anything? Would you change anything? How would you adapt those teeth?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, only 4 months in the role, so I'm cautious about asking for more powers at this stage. I certainly think, we don't have a big budget for this role, and there is a lot to do. So the well-being goals cover all aspects of what the public sector might do and what happens in Wales more generally. So there are so many things that I could be getting involved in and commenting on or supporting or advising on. Um, that's just not possible. And so I'm going through a really difficult time of trying to prioritize at the moment and understand where I can make the most impact, which will mean some tough decisions about where I, don't play a role because there's just too much to do. Um, I think the other area might be in terms of a casework function potentially, although that could be huge. So I get a lot of contact already to the office about supporting particular cases and advising people on particular circumstances or particular issues that they're dealing with. Well, other commissioners, we have an older persons commissioner and a children's commissioner in Wales, and they have a casework function and they can provide direct and advice support to individuals or groups where I don't have that function. And I think that would be useful. And there are other areas as well, bigger picture issues in terms of, perhaps really requiring organizations, public bodies to act on the recommendations that I make, that would give me very real teeth. But I've got to be careful because I'm not elected, and of course the elected politicians have a democratic mandate, and that's the right thing. So they're the ultimate decision makers, and they're the ones that have responsibility for allocating resources and taking those decisions. That's not my role. So, it's a careful balance here, recognizing that they're ultimately responsible and they have the budgets to do that. And my job is to advise, assess, monitor, and review where action isn't being taken properly.
You mentioned the word a balancing act, and you mentioned that you're sort of early in the role, and I want to harken back to one of these things you said when you were taking on the new role. You asked the question, how do we get people to think about the future when they're worried about how they're going to pay this month's bills? And we firmly believe that getting to net zero, for instance, will help us with the cost of living crisis. And you went on thereafter. And so I wonder, can you help us understand, how do you answer your own question?
It's massively challenging to do that, and one of the ways in which that is done is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act allows public bodies to take this broader picture into account. So, in order to justify a decision, they can look at the seven well-being goals and take account of environment, social, community, as well as economy, and other aspects of, other parts of the goals, the 7, when they're taking decisions. So that allows them to take a bigger picture. They don't, or they shouldn't take account of just one goal or one area in which they work. So I think that's one of the ways in which it's important. I think what we try to do is provide information around future trends and future trends reports so that we can inform public sector bodies in their decision making on the basis of what is likely to happen or what is going to happen on the basis of data and information we have. So that can be very influential as well. I think also sometimes it's a matter of putting particular tools in place that enable this to happen. So I give one example of a hospital here in South Wales whereby they put in a solar farm to supply energy to the hospital, directly to the hospital. And when it opened, they got a lot of interest in this, a lot of positive interest, but the challenge was, why are you spending this money on a solar farm when we've got people waiting outside hospitals in ambulances to be seen by accident and emergency? Surely that's a bigger priority. And what had happened in that instance was they'd been given dedicated funding for energy or environmental projects, so it couldn't be used for the accident and emergency department. So they were able to more easily defend their decision, which could have been, and you can understand why it might be criticised by those people who are, not receiving the healthcare service that they would want. And actually, that's been a great decision. They opened this solar farm before the war in Ukraine, I believe, and energy prices here have gone up by a huge amount, and the savings to the hospital and the health board have been significant and have gone beyond what they first anticipated. And those savings can now go back into the delivery of healthcare services for the people of that area. But it would have been really challenging for them to do that if they hadn't have had this allocated or separate budget provided to them by the Welsh Government.
I think your example of the demand, the aspiration, the need for medical care right now, your population is aging as our population is aging, that puts different pressures on public finance. I think it's a lovely segue for where I'd like to go next. In Canada, as we've been thinking about our strategy, so inspired by your role, what's happening in Wales, we've been thinking about, do we want a commissioner or minister for future generations, or do we want both a commissioner and a minister responsible for generational fairness? And we've opted for the latter because the latter invites us to have conversations not just about, as you talked about, those who were unborn, but also those here today as well, and to talk about some of the tensions that are emerging among generations alive today. And so a lot of our work talks about, and consistent with your focus on net zero, we've extracted so much of the atmosphere's scarce capacity to absorb carbon. We're leaving little of that capacity left over, and extreme weather is the legacy. But when we bring that intergenerational tension to other issues like housing, for instance, so much wealth has been extracted from our housing system for homeowners, especially those who got in some decades ago. We leave little affordability left over. Or in our country context, we have a lot of extraction of tax dollars from economic growth today to go to retirement income security and medical care for the aging family members in our lives who we love. But then we're leaving relatively less left over to invest in the childcare or in some of the housing supports and education for our younger demographic. So our work is trying to draw attention to these power dynamics and risks between generations at this moment of success, longevity that we've achieved, but also a demographic shift as that big baby boom has been moving through its life course and getting now to a later stage in lives, which can be more expensive as part of the human reality. And so I wonder, how do you experience that tension or that challenge of addressing tensions between generations today and maintaining your focus toward those who are unborn? That seems to be like an interesting balancing act in your your act that governs your work seems to incline you to be a little bit more future focused and maybe, dancing around some of the tensions that exist here and now?
Well, we try to do both, and there is a children's commissioner that particularly looks at the interests of the younger generation today, and we work very closely together. But we try to do both. So I find that involving young people in particular in decision making and in talking to public sector leaders can be very influential, not just in representing their interests as younger people today, but also in taking that long-term perspective, because they're also, or that longer-term perspective, because they're also likely to be the generation that's going to be here in 50 years in the same sort of timescale that I've been talking about. So, it's interesting that I think for me we try to do the both at the same time. I don't see any challenge in trying to do both of those things at the same time. And one of the ways that we've done that is we have a Future Generations Leadership Academy of young people between 18 and 30, and they are supported to have a good education and understanding of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and how it's applied. But they're also involved in reverse mentoring our public sector leaders, so they're able to talk directly and influence public sector leaders in today's decision making, and that seems to be very impactful. So we do try to do both of those things. We talk more about future generations and long-term thinking than perhaps we do talk about intergenerational justice. But I've only just recently put together a statement with the Children's Commissioner on this very issue, actually with the Older Persons Commissioner at the same time, to highlight the need for the interests of all generations to be considered and thought about in decision making.
Oh, that's really interesting. Let us make sure that we stay apprised of that and watch you operate in that way. I think it's interesting you referred to working for them with the Commissioner for Older Persons. Is that the precise name? We don't have that same, we talk about seniors here, but I like that older persons is a nice phrase. And when I listen to you, I think I hear you say so much of your role as the commissioner, being able to say things that are potentially unpopular, a little more risky for a politician to say than for you. I think you're often in the business probably of creating political cover for our world of politics to respond bravely to some of the evidence about the intergenerational tensions that exist today and into the future. And you mentioned a moment ago about working with the commissioner responsible for children, and that makes me think a lot about Jen Squeeze's earlier work, where like a voice for younger Canadians and trying to showcase how a lot of economic risk has moved toward them and given them that power to speak in our world of politics and bust some myths that it's not just they're eating too many avocado toast or drinking too many lattes. But more and more, as we're shifting strategy, we've got the world to recognize that a younger demographic faces a range of vulnerabilities. Their hard work isn't paying off quite like it used to. They face existential risks with climate change. These days, though, we're needing to go beyond that recognition to taking action. I find that we're needing to go more and operate like I suspect your Commissioner for Older Persons might be doing, and try to harness some of the power of that demographic to say, yes, we need to get our medical care right first. We're worried about our incomes in retirement. But those needs need to be met simultaneously with ensuring we're leaving the kind of legacy we want for our kids and grandchildren. So I wonder, as you're trying to create political cover for that kind of long-term thinking, what actions or strategies do you take to sort of collaborate with older persons and harness their power to provide some of that political cover to think long term?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Perhaps we haven't done enough of that actually, of working directly with an older demographic. But I think your point is right about the ability to, I wouldn't call it political cover, but creating a space for these bold decisions. So we're in an emergency, aren't we? We're in a climate and nature emergency. We need bold and radical action. and someone needs to be saying that, and we need government to potentially be taking really unpopular decisions. And I do see my role as providing, some support for some of those decisions. So it's not my job to say whether the specifics of the decision are the right thing to do necessarily, but that the need for bold and urgent action is necessary in this space. So I'll give you an example. We, in our capital city, the city of Cardiff, the council is looking to put road user charging in place as a way of reducing the number of cars in the city, air quality, etc., raising money for public transport and all those sorts of things. You can imagine, that is not going to be popular with everyone. And it's the first city in Wales to do so. Other parts of the UK cities have gone down this path. London has had something similar for a long time. And I do see it as my, not for me to get involved in, you should be charging these vehicles and you should be charging that price, but to say this is the type of radical and bold action that is needed in this climate emergency. If we carry on just, tweaking around the edges and not thinking about, big changes, then we're not going to get the country ready for the future and not do justice to current or future generations. So the point you make about, the role in creating a space for these bold and urgent decisions, I think is an important one for me.
One example that I was particularly impressed with, your predecessor, it looks like, was able to intervene in the planning for a major highway project. And I'm curious if you can tell us that story, how that happened, and what exactly change happened, because it was a big change and probably, I imagine, unpopular. And then I'm also just curious, was it unpopular? How did you overcome not you, but your predecessor, how did they overcome any resistance?
Yeah, it was a big decision and probably the biggest change that we might point to as a result of this legislation, this law. And my predecessor, Sophie Howe, called out basically a decision that was being taken by the Welsh government to build a relief road, a motorway relief road around the city of Newport, which would have cost billions, I think, and would have been a debt for future generations to come, but would have also damaged some sites of special interest, nature sites and so forth, and exacerbated the problem. We know creating more road space encourages more cars, creates more congestion, pollution and so forth. So we know all of those things. And so she, gave evidence and publicly spoke out to say this cannot be justified on the basis of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and bravely said to the public and to the government that this could not be justified. And so that decision was changed, and they didn't go ahead with that that additional road, that relief road. There was a couple of things I would say about that. It was really important. It wasn't popular. It was popular with some, but not with others. Happens to be in an area where I was brought up, and so I know people. I know my parents didn't think it was a great decision because they felt that they were going to be stuck on the motorway in congestion for longer, and it needed to be sorted. But many people supported it, and it's been accepted. It's still politically sensitive subject, so political parties still debate the subject and bring it up on a regular basis. But what's happened now is we're seeing a real shift in transport policy. So we are now seeing roughly a third of our budget for transport in Welsh Government spent on roads, whereas it used to be 2/3 spent on roads. We've seen a significant increase in the budget spent on active travel, so cycling and walking. and we're going through that transition period whereby hopefully we're going to see improved public transport services and more people biking and cycling. It's very controversial. It's always in the news, and we're not there yet. I mean, this has to be about outcomes for people, doesn't it? So if people feel that, this hasn't worked, the solution is not resolved, and we don't get to a place where congestion is resolved and people are able to use public transport as an alternative to driving in a practical way, then we haven't got to the place we need to get to, and we're not there yet. We need to get to the outcomes, and not just pat ourselves on the back for a brave decision, but follow that through into other solutions that are going to make put in place the solutions that we need. So we're going through that process. I'm very positive about the journey that we are taking, but we need to, continue with that so that we do resolve the issues which were the problem we were first trying to look at.
So it's clear that that's a really interesting example of bringing your legislation and act to bear on a transportation project. So I think infrastructure has been a theme been raising regularly. I think back to the solar farm adjacent to the hospital. Does your office have the capacity to reflect on age or generational trends in sort of operational spending, the relative balance in spending on medical care, say, relative to education or to social services, and how that plays out along age and generational lines? Do you have resources that you're able to bring to bear on that front?
We haven't done that in the 4 months that I've been in the role, and I'm not aware that we've done that in the last 7 years. It is something that we could do. Nothing to stop us doing that, should we be able to find the resources to look at those sorts of things. And I think that could be, very useful work for us to do. And either work with partners or to use our own resources to look at this kind of analysis. But it is exactly the space in which we could be acting and drawing attention to particular spending decisions or trends or impacts in terms of what the impact on certain groups over others, and how it might be detrimental, and how the broader view should be taken when these decisions are being considered. So yeah, not something that I'm aware that we've done specifically, but certainly something that's in the in the powers of the office to be able to do.
One of our asks of our senior levels of government is to begin reporting their budget trends by age. In addition to, we have something called GBA plus, gender-based analysis plus, so a lot of attention to income trends, gender trends, racialized trends, and so on. And we've advocated for governments to bring an age or generational lens. We're making some progress on that front. Does your government break down its budget analyses by age in a way that's transparent for you to comment on, or for citizens more generally?
I don't know that they do, but I was in a meeting with Welsh Government budget team yesterday, and we were talking about gender budgeting, and they do a fair amount to think about gender budgeting and how budgeting in budget decisions impact on gender, and what the considerations need to be made about funding decisions. And I asked that question. I asked the question, you're thinking about gender, but how do you think about age or race or other protected characteristics when you are thinking about budgets? And the answer to that question was they weren't doing that directly, but actually as part of thinking about gender and thinking about equality and equity impact in funding decisions, it was, I think, raising their awareness and enabling them to have a much more detailed understanding of the impact on lots of different groups. So I would think we're at a relatively early stage in some of that thinking, and I'd love to know more about what you're doing and to share that with colleagues here. Our civil servants are working as part of the Alliance of Wellbeing Economy Governments on this work. So, and I think they mentioned that they were particularly working with colleagues in Finland to understand how they consider this and how we might apply it. So I think we're probably, we've done a fair amount of work. We've got a fair way to go in thinking about this. And I was also concerned to make sure that this wasn't just being done at the Welsh Government level, so at the country level, but this was being done by other public bodies as well. And we were sharing the learning, with local authorities and the health authorities as well.
Well, we're collaborating closely with our government here in British Columbia, which is the one province among several in Canada, and making some really interesting headway. And that should come to public light more in the early fall. So we'll send it your way.
Please do share that with us.
As an example. My last question, because I'm conscious of the time, and then maybe I'll hand it over to Megan to wrap up. Throughout our conversation today, you've done something that doesn't always happen on our Hard Truths podcast. You're regularly blending together a generational perspective with a concern about well-being. And we have something that we call in Canada, Get Well Canada. That's one of our initiatives at Generation Squeeze we're doing in partnership with many other groups. And in Canada, we're in a space that's it's unique, I think, compared to the Wales experience. We're next to the United States of America. There's just massive influence on not only the world, but it's an elephant. We're a little mouse. And Canadians often try and figure out, how is this little mouse different from the elephant? And how do we define ourselves as a nation? And one thing we often recognize is that our neighbors to the south, by contrast with us and Wales and other countries, they don't have a publicly funded medical care system. And so Canadians have really locked onto that culture. We know we are different from our neighbors to the south because we have publicly funded medical care. And it's kind of created this then cultural tradition that when we are good and just and noble, we do more medical care to treat people's illness when they fall sick. One of the implications of that cultural trend over the last decades is that we have more urgently been increasing funding to treat illness after the fact, but we've kind of lost sight of promoting well-being to prevent people from falling sick in the first place. And so back in the mid-70s, all of our provinces were spending more on social and education issues than on medicine. But if you flash forward to today, the reverse is the case. I hear you fusing together a sense of let's promote well-being. Perhaps I would say from the early years onwards, thinking, to those who are unborn as well, in the right balance and proportion to what we do to treat problems after the fact, including illness. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you fuse the well-being and the generational fairness lenses together? It's really striking.
Right. Well, I'm not sure we're doing it as effectively as you perhaps are making out there. I mean, we have the National Health Service, publicly funded, free at the point of use health service, and it is massively underfunded at the moment, really suffering with high levels of waiting lists and huge levels of demand. Like you just gone through a COVID, like the rest of the world, gone through a COVID pandemic and put all sorts of pressures on the service. So it is probably one of the most difficult parts of my role already to be supporting us to think, well-being and thinking, long-term health and preventing problems rather than dealing with the urgent demands on the healthcare service that we see. But having said that, we are, starting to see some changes and some really good practice examples whereby, I mentioned, a longer-term health strategy, I think, at the beginning of this conversation, but also, increasingly looking at initiatives that are around social prescribing and so forth. So, that is helping people to respond to issues, perhaps around mental health that people are facing today, but also avoiding those problems happening in the future. So I think it's fair to say the health sector is, those delivering direct healthcare services are probably, the most challenging for me to engage with just because of the pressures on their services. But we have an excellent organisation called Public Health Wales, which is separate to government, a sponsored body, which is very much aligned to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So one of my first meetings was with Public Health Wales, and all that they do is the law around well-being is embedded in everything that they do, and you see it right across their range of work program. So I think that makes a big difference, that we have a separate agency there that falls under the Act, that has run with the Act and is really thinking well-being and long-term health prevention, as you would expect an organisation like Public Health Wales to be doing. That sits out, has huge pressures as well, but is not sitting within health boards, those that, providing primary and secondary healthcare services here. So that might be part of it. So, again, I think it's an area where we see green shoots. We see some really great practice, but we need to see more of it, and we need to see that mainstreamed. And it's my job to say that, this is happening over there, this is possible. The legislation tells you to do it. We need to see that right across Wales, so all citizens can benefit. So, it's a work in progress, but some positive examples to cite.
Just in case our listeners don't know the term social prescribing, could you explain what that means?
Right. Well, social prescribing, I probably haven't got the exact definition in my head, but it's about prescribing, or a GP or a doctor offering a social response to a healthcare issue. So, for example, I think in Cardiff, a doctor here might be able to say, rather than give an individual pills or medicine directly for a mental health care problem, they might prescribe a rental bike and say, well, I encourage you're going to use that money to enable you to have a rental bike every day for you to take some physical exercise. And I think that as a way of supporting your mental well-being, rather than going to a medicine or a pill that might help. So it's that type of thing. There are lots of other examples of how that might be done, but certainly physical activity is often one of those things that we talk about when we think about social prescribing as a route, rather than medicine.
We have it in Canada, where many a doctor, they would often like to be able to prescribe more housing or childcare or poverty reduction. They're not really in the position to be able to do that, but they know that really is the social medicine that would be more important than the pill, to use Derek's term.
Yeah, and this is something that we do see actually coming through work around our law. So one of the things that we've set up as a result of the law is collaborative structures, whereby public bodies come together. They're called public service boards, and they're meant to come together and collaborate on areas of common interest. And one part of our country, they're focusing on those wider determinants of health, so very much thinking about the root causes of healthcare problems and doing it under this legislation and doing that collaboratively, which I guess might not otherwise happen if it hadn't been for this law.
Yeah. Well, I know we are almost out of time, and I have a bigger picture question, because I did read that you're a father, right?
Yeah, I've got 2 children. Yep.
So I'm curious Oh, is that his back?
They're there, but that's a few years ago, actually. They're a lot older than that now.
Well, if 50 years from now, what would you want your 2 children to reflect on? What would be your dream achievements as the Future Generations Commissioner for them to be proud of?
What a question. I mean, it's got to be about impact, hasn't it? And change, and making real and substantial difference, and and supporting the public bodies to make that difference. When I talk in interviews around this, I talk about things like having rivers that are clean for our children and grandchildren to swim in, and air that we can breathe, and having protected the biodiversity of the country, and having the kind of nature, fauna and flora that I am able to enjoy, that is still here for them to be able to enjoy. And I think that's sort of fundamental when you think about this role and you think about the long term and you think what really matters to people. It's those types of things that are likely to be the things that, or will be the things that people will want us to have focused on, rather than some of the day-to-day issues that perhaps we get more attention. Those are the things that matter, aren't they, for the well-being of future generations? And if we hold on to those thoughts and focus on getting that right, we'll go a long way to protecting Wales for future generations.
Well, I can imagine that your kids 50 years hence will be looking back with a great deal of pride about the legacy that you're striving to leave for them and for
I really hope
your country
so.
context.
I don't think they really know what job I do most of the time, but yeah.
50 years from now, I'm sure that will be clearer, and I think we're really all indebted. We were calling you from an ocean away to draw on the inspiration that you're creating not only in your own community and country, but for those of us around the planet. And in this moment where there are real risks and reasons to be anxious about what the next decades hold for ourselves, our kids, and our grandchildren, your role and the heavy weight I think you must at certain moments feel fulfilling that role in Wales is one of the key levers out there that I think can help leverage the change and the adaptation to make your country, our country, the planet work for all generations.
Well, thank you. I mean, we can only do this together, and we put this legislation in place because we were inspired by what was going on elsewhere, and we've adapted it to our own circumstances. And but we've got so much to learn from what you're doing and what countries around the world are doing. So, I really enjoy these conversations, but hopefully that can be. This can be a conversation that's the start of many conversations where we share what we're doing and our experiences for mutual benefit. So thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you so much.